Welcome back to the Paranormal State, Washington, and UFO UAP. With Makāula Nakae, a lifelong experiencer and ET contactee since 1990. Today's episode, 1964, Tall White. The specific archetype known in ufology as the Tall Whites first entered public history and modern lore through the extensive accounts of Charles James Hall. Charles James Hall, the Air Force veteran behind the Tall White legend. Few figures in modern ufology occupy a space as distinct as Charles James Hall. While most alien contact narratives involve civilians plucked from rural highways or suburban backyards, Hall's story is rooted in the high-security landscape of the Cold War military-industrial complex. His accounts introduced the specific archetype of the Tall Whites into the lexicon of fringe history, creating a narrative that blends classified military operations, desert survival, and deep extraterrestrial contact. Charles James Hall first came to the public eye in late 2002 with the publication of his self-published book, Millennial Hospitality. For nearly 40 years after leaving Nellis Air Force Base in the late 1960s, Hall kept his experiences strictly private. It wasn't until 2002, decades after his service, that he decided to share his story, packaging his accounts into a semi-autobiographical book series. Following the release of his books, he stepped into the broader public sphere by appearing on radio shows, alternative history podcasts, and documentary segments to discuss his interactions with the Tall Whites. Strictly speaking, Charles James Hall is the person who coined and popularized the exact term Tall Whites. Before he published Millennial Hospitality in 2002, the precise label Tall Whites did not exist in ufology. However, the reason it felt familiar to many people are aligned with existing lore when he came out is because earlier archetypes laid the groundwork decades prior. The concepts that paved the way include the 1950s Nordic alien space brothers throughout the 1950s, contactees like George Adamski, Howard Menger, and various European witnesses popularized stories of human-like extraterrestrials. These beings were routinely described as standing 6 to 7 feet tall, possessing strikingly pale skin, light or blonde hair, and piercing blue eyes. Frequently characterized as benevolent, beautiful, and wise guardians are travelers from the Pleiades. Tall, chalk-white, and pale humanoid beings were extensively documented in abduction lore long before 2002. While the 1950s Nordic space brother archetype represents one specific lineage, the abduction boom of the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, led by researchers like Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, Dr. John E. Mack, and authors like Whitley Strieber routinely recorded encounters with tall, non-Nordic white beings. Before Charles Hall published his military memoirs in 2002, several distinct categories of tall and white entities were recognized among abductees. The tall gray doctor hierarchy, 1980s to 1990s. In standard abduction research, abductees rarely interacted only with the short 3 to 4 foot worker grays. Under hypnosis and debriefings, abductees frequently described an overseer or doctor figure standing 6 to 8 feet tall. While often grouped under the gray umbrella, witnesses frequently noted that their skin was chalk white, sickly alabaster, or paper pale, rather than gunmetal gray. They possessed spindly frames, long fingers, and an intensely cold clinical demeanor. The Travis Walton encounter, 1975. One of the most famous abduction cases in history directly featured human-sized and tall beings on board a craft. While Walton first encountered 3 short, bulbous-headed beings with pale skin, he fled deeper into the craft and was met by tall, human-proportioned figures with strikingly pale, smooth white skin wearing glass-like helmets and blue jumpsuits. They were not the blonde-haired space brothers giving spiritual lectures. They were silent clinical overseers who led him to an examination room without speaking a word. The hybrids and late-stage beings, David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins. In the late 1980s and 1990s, Temple University historian Dr. David Jacobs and artist Bud Hopkins compiled hundreds of abduction accounts detailing an alleged hybridization program. Abductees routinely reported encountering tall beings that were a cross between humans and greys. These beings were described as very tall, extremely slender, with translucent, paper-white or chalky skin, wispy white or light hair, and large, deep-set dark eyes. They were specifically recognized as a distinct class of entities aboard craft, long before the turn of the millennium. Whitley Strieber's Communion, 1987, and diverse visitors. When Whitley Strieber published Communion in 1987, he didn't describe just one type of being. Alongside the iconic face on the book cover, Strieber detailed interactions in his upstate New York cabin with short, stocky beings in blue coveralls, very tall, thin figures with ghostly, porcelain white skin and sharp, angular facial features. When Charles James Hall published Millennial Hospitality in 2002, the UFO and abduction community did not find the physical description entirely foreign. Abductees had already spent 30 years describing tall, chalk-white, hairless, or thin-haired humanoids walking the corridors of craft. What Hall changed was the setting and relationship. Instead of seeing them as terrifying nocturnal abductors taking people from their bedrooms, Hall placed them in the sunny, open expanse of the Nevada desert, interacting directly with Air Force personnel on a classified military base. Tall grays and tall whites are not the same. While both belong to the taxonomy of humanoid entities reported in ufology and abduction lore, they represent distinctly different physiological archetypes, behaviors, and cultural origins within the UFO community. The key differences between the two include physical appearance and anatomy. Tall grays. These are generally viewed as an evolved, higher-ranking tier of the traditional gray alien. They stand around 6 to 8 feet tall, but they share the classic gray features: oversized heads, large wraparound black eyes, a thin or absent nose, a slit-like mouth, and skin that is gray, ash-colored or pale blue-gray. Their bodies are exceptionally slender and spindly. Tall whites. These beings stand between 6 and 8 feet tall, but they look human-proportioned, rather than insectoid or alien hybrid. Their skin is explicitly described as chalk-white or stark alabaster, not gray, and they have thin lips, pointed teeth, and hair, often described as blonde-white or wispy. Charles Hall famously noted that their skin turns paper white and translucent as they age. Behavioral and cultural roles. Tall grays. In abduction literature, such as the research of Bud Hopkins and Dr. David Jacobs, tall grays act as the clinical overseers or doctors aboard craft. They manage medical procedures, genetic harvesting, and the day-to-day operations of the abduction protocol. They are almost universally described as cold, emotionless, and strictly utilitarian. Tall whites. According to Charles Hall's military-adjacent accounts, they live in family units, raise children, possess a recognizable culture, and exhibit a full range of human-like emotions, ranging from fierce protectiveness and pride to petty anger and arrogance. They operate more like an independent, highly advanced civilization with its own societal hierarchy than clinical medical operators. Context of the encounter. Tall grays are encountered almost exclusively during nocturnal, indoor abduction scenarios, appearing inside bedrooms, hallways, or examination rooms where time is often distorted. Tall whites are famously associated with open-air, terrestrial environments, specifically the sun-baked expanses of the Nevada desert, where they walk around outdoors, interact with military personnel, and inhabit hidden surface-subsurface settlements. While both categories feature tall, slender overseer figures that can easily be confused at a glance, tall grays are fundamentally tied to the classic hive mind gray abduction narrative, whereas tall whites are viewed as a distinct humanoid civilization-based species with pale, chalk-white skin. How Charles Hall shifted the trope. While 1950s Nordics were portrayed as angelic, spiritual teachers warning humanity about nuclear weapons, Charles Hall introduced a completely different spin. His tall whites weren't mystical space brothers. They were described as an aloof, scientifically detached, and deeply pragmatic military-adjacent species. They had a harsh survivalist culture, aging processes that turned their skin chalk-white and translucent, and a tense, calculated coexistence with the U.S. military in the Nevada desert. So, while others had talked about tall, pale, humanoid aliens for 50 years under the banner of Nordics, Hall gave them their specific name, tied them directly to black-budget Cold War military operations, and brought the tall white legend into the modern era. Background and military service, 1964 to 1967. Charles James Hall earned a degree in physics from San Diego State University before enlisting in the United States Air Force. In the mid-1960s, he was assigned to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, specifically stationed out in the harsh, desolate expanse of the Indian Springs Gunnery Range. Now part of the infamous Nevada Test and Training Range, adjacent to areas associated with Groom Lake Area 51. As an Air Force weather observer, an airman first class, Hall's primary duty was tracking high-altitude weather patterns, wind shears, and meteorological data to ensure safety for experimental aircraft testing and gunnery exercises. The job required long stretches of intense isolation in primitive desert outposts, surrounded by mountain ranges, dry lake beds, and heavy restricted airspace. It was within this hyper-isolated, high-stress environment that Hall claimed his unprecedented encounters began. According to Hall's extensive multi-volume autobiographical series, Millennial Hospitality, published starting in 2002, his initial encounters with the tall whites began around 1965. Hall described the beings as human-like but distinctly alien. They stood between 6 and 8 feet tall, possessed chalk-white skin, striking blue eyes that could shift in color or intensity, and near-translucent hair. Their vocalizations were not human speech. Hall described them as sounding like bird-like chirps, whistles, or clicks, though they could communicate via a form of direct telepathy or high-frequency projection. Hall described them as living in small family units or clans scattered across the remote Nevada desert, moving through secret underground habitations and cave systems. Despite their frail-looking, almost ethereal physical appearance, Hall noted they possessed terrifying physical strength, incredible speed, and an absolute intolerance for being startled or cornered. The most explosive and controversial aspect of Hall's testimony is not just that he saw extraterrestrials, but that elements of the U.S. military were fully aware of them and actively cooperating with them. Hall claimed that high-ranking military brass and intelligence handlers maintained a working diplomatic and scientific exchange with the tall whites. According to his account, the military traded desert territory, security buffers, and supplies in exchange for advanced technological insights, weather control data, and spacefaring logistics. Because Hall was often stationed alone out in the desert weather shacks, he frequently crossed paths with them. Over time, mutual recognition and instances where Hall reportedly saved tall white children or was protected by them from desert hazards built a strange, fragile rapport. After completing his military service, Hall pursued a civilian career in physics, working in nuclear physics and patent engineering. For decades, he kept his desert experiences entirely to himself, fearing professional ruin, psychiatric stigmatization, or violations of his military security oaths. Beginning in 2002 with the self-publication of Millennial Hospitality, The World of the Tall Whites, Hall laid out his experiences in exhaustive, novelized detail. He followed this with multiple sequels, public lectures, radio appearances, and even a minor role in documentary films. Within the UFO community, Hall became a polarizing figure. Skeptics and military historians dismiss his claims as an elaborate, scientifically literate work of science fiction, pointing out the total lack of paper trails or corroborating witnesses from Nellis Air Force Base during those exact years. Conversely, believers view Hall as a remarkably credible whistleblower, citing his physics background, his lack of sensationalized pop culture tropes, and the precise, mundane details of military life he wove into his accounts. Whether viewed as a profound whistleblowing account of secret government diplomacy or an elaborate sci-fi masterwork, Charles James Hall's narrative permanently altered ufology, cementing the tall whites as one of the most haunting archetypes of modern contact lore. Hall claimed that his encounters with this specific group of extraterrestrials occurred while he was serving as a U.S. Air Force weather observer, stationed at Nellis Air Force Base, specifically the Indian Springs Gunnery Range, in Nevada between 1964 and 1967. While the experiences happened in the mid-1960s, Hall did not bring them into the public eye immediately. He kept them private for decades before finally publishing his multi-volume autobiographical series, Millennial Hospitality, starting in 2002, which formally introduced the tall whites nomenclature to the broader UFO community. According to Hall's testimony, the tall whites were an extraterrestrial humanoid species, characterized by chalk-white skin, extreme height, ranging from 6 to over 7 feet. piercing blue eyes, which he noted could turn pink or red as they aged, and a symbiotic, highly secretive working relationship with elements of the U.S. military. While Charles Hall coined and popularized the exact term, tall whites, based on his 1960s military service, they are frequently cross-referenced or loosely linked in ufology with older Nordic alien or space brother narratives from the 1950s, popularized by contactees like George Adamski and Howard Menger. Though Hall's descriptions painted the tall whites as far more aloof, technical, and morally neutral than the benevolent, spiritual Pleiadians of earlier contact lore. The tall whites are a race of extraterrestrials that have garnered significant attention due to the accounts of Charles Hall, a former weather observer at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. According to Hall, these beings have interacted with the U.S. military and have a unique relationship with Earth. Tall whites are described as tall, frail, and with chalk-white skin. They are humanoid in appearance but have some distinct differences from humans, such as larger eyes and less hair. They are said to live for up to 800 years, growing taller as they age, reaching heights of up to 9 feet. Their language sounds like dog barking or bird calls, but they can learn to speak English and mimic human speech. Hall claims the tall whites have agreed to share technology with the U.S. Air Force, primarily in radio and communication systems. However, they have not shared faster-than-light travel or deep space propulsion technologies. The technology exchange has been strictly controlled and only involved technologies that would benefit the tall whites as well. The tall whites reportedly use Earth as a way station for their deep space travels. They refuel, repair, and resupply their crafts at bases like Nellis AFB. They also participate in classified meetings with military officials and assist in certain technological developments. Hall mentioned that these extraterrestrials have occasionally been allowed to leave the base, disguising themselves as humans to visit places like Las Vegas. The tall whites' primary motivation is using Earth as a logistical base for their space travels. They seem uninterested in colonizing or dominating Earth, preferring to maintain a peaceful coexistence with the U.S. military. However, their interactions with humans can be fraught with tension. There have been incidents where tall whites have threatened or harmed humans, especially if they felt threatened or if their children were frightened. Hall's accounts suggest that the tall whites have been around Nellis AFB since at least the 1950s. They have a long history of interacting with military personnel, sometimes leading to misunderstandings and confrontations. Despite this, they have maintained a functional relationship with the U.S. government, leveraging their advanced technology for mutual benefit. The tall whites are a fascinating and complex part of UFO lore, characterized by their unique appearance, long lifespan, and cautious but cooperative interactions with the U.S. military. Their primary interest in Earth is logistical, using it as a base for their deep space operations, while maintaining a delicate balance in their human interactions. To be continued. Watch and listen. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full podcast now. Explore the archive Cosmic Awakening Volume 1, 1991, Peru, Journey into the Unknown, Sacred Valley of the Incas. Volume 2, Ascension 2012, The Golden Alchemy. Part 3, The First Contact and the Paranormal State. Join the journey. New episodes drop periodically. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute exploration into the evolution of ufology, perfect for your daily plunge into decoding hidden messages from outer space, designed to raise awareness and foster human evolution. Subscribe to support your inner development. Thumbs up to help push our channel through the algorithm. Comment below. Share your thoughts on today's episode.